In this video, we will be looking at how the nature versus nurture debate relates to the consideration of mental health and mental disorder. "45% of the population in Australia, aged from 16 to 85 years old, will experience a mental disorder. Yet there is still a lot we have not discovered or we do not understand about the ways a person can be affected by mental health issues. When it comes to the causes of mental disorders, scientists have been studying for decades to try and find out whether our genetics play a definitive role, but they are still lacking solid evidence. In fact, many people believe that our genetics does contribute to the causes of mental illnesses, but our life events and our environment factors are just as important. The nature versus nurture aspects of mental health have been explored for a long time. Nature means that you are the way you are based on primarily your genetics, and it relates to the biological influences. Nurture means that you are like a blank slate, and you are influenced based on your upbringing, environment, and your life experiences. The truth is that both can influence you, and both can impact your mental health just as much. Now, we will be discussing the different ways nature and nurture factors can influence the mental health and mental disorders of individuals.
Some mental health disorders are caused by chromosome abnormalities. Autism spectrum disorder, for example, is thought to be caused by chromosome and genetic abnormalities in some cases, although it is said to be triggered by environmental factors. Other mental health disorders are caused by chemical imbalance or dysfunction in the neural pathways that facilitate these chemicals to disperse in the brain, like in the case of anorexia nervosa. Mental illnesses sometimes run in families, suggesting that people who have a family member with a mental illness may be somewhat more likely to develop one themselves. Susceptibility is passed on in families through genes. Experts believe that many mental illnesses are linked to abnormalities in many genes rather than one or a few, and that how these genes interact with the environment is unique for every person, even identical twins. This is why a person inherits a susceptibility to a mental illness and doesn't necessarily develop the illness. Mental illness itself occurs from the interaction of multiple genes and other factors such as stress, abuse, or a traumatic event, which can influence or trigger an illness in a person who has inherited susceptibility to it. An analogy I'd use is Russian roulette. If you're born with the genes for bipolar, then you have 3 bullets in the revolver. Spin the chamber around and fire. The guy might shoot or he might not. Now you add in nurture, or the lack thereof, and you can easily add additional bullets. Mental illness is likely 50-50 nature versus nurture. You can have a wonderful childhood and still become mentally ill, yet for many people they have experienced abuse and trauma, which activated the gene for mental illness. Genetics can explain the 20 to 95% of patient variability in response to individual psychotropic medicines. This is a large percentage that shows the importance of genetics in whether or not people will respond well to their psychotropic medicines. If a patient has poor response to medicine, it could lead to further progression of a mental health disorder. For example, someone who has schizophrenia has a genetic abnormality that causes them to respond poorly to their medicine. Their schizophrenia gets worse due to the body's lack of response to the medications. There are certain genes that are known to trigger mental health disorders. One of these examples is the DISC1 gene, which has been associated with schizophrenia. For example, if someone had this particular gene, they would be much more susceptible to getting schizophrenia. Yet not everyone with this gene develops schizophrenia. Environmental triggers such as alcohol abuse or a stressful home environment would make them much more likely to suffer from schizophrenia. In one depression study, it was found that in some variations in the gene that regulates the stress hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone, or CRH, could protect those who had been abused as children. At the end of the day, it's not a question of genes versus environment. It's a question of how genes interact with whatever the environmental factors might be. and that is probably true of all the disorders that we call mental illness.
The idea of nature is what we think of as pre-wiring and is influenced by genetic inheritance and other biological factors. The nature-nurture debate is concerned with the relative contribution that both influences make to human behavior, such as personality, cognitive traits, temperament, and psychopathology. An extreme nature position is called nativism. It has long been known that certain physical characteristics are biologically determined by genetic inheritance. Color of eyes, straight or curly hair, pigmentation of the skin, and certain diseases are all a function of the genes we inherit. These facts have led many to speculate as to whether psychological characteristics such as behavioral tendencies, personality attributes, and mental abilities are also wired in before we are born. Those who adopt an extreme hereditary position are known as nativists. Their basic assumption is that the characteristics of the human species as a whole are a product of evolution and that individual differences are due to each person's unique genetic code. In general, the earlier a particular ability appears, the more likely it is to be under the influence of genetic factors. Estimates of genetic influence are called heritability. Examples of an extreme nature position in psychology include a study done by Chomsky in 1965, who proposed languages gained through the use of an innate language acquisition device. Another example of nature is Freud's theory of aggression as being an innate drive. This was called thanatos. Characteristics and differences that are not observable at birth, but which emerge later in life, are regarded as the product of maturation. That is to say, we all have an inner biological clock which switches on or off our types of behavior in a pre-programmed way. The classical example of the way this affects our physical development are the bodily changes that occur in early adolescence and puberty. However, nativists also argue that maturation governs the emergence of attachment in infancy, language acquisition, and even cognitive development as a whole. In today's day and age, there is almost no one who accepts either of the extreme cases of nature or nurture, as there are far too many facts pointing to the influence of both. So the question that is then asked is, how much do either of these facts influence development, and which is more important? This question was first framed by Francis Galton, a relative of Charles Darwin in the 19th century, who suggested that intellectual ability was largely inherited and that the tendency for genius to run in the family was the outcome of natural superiority. This view has been brought up time and time again, more recently by American psychologist Arthur Jensen. He found that the average IQ scores of black Americans were significantly lower than those of the whites. He went on to argue that genetic factors were mainly responsible, even going as far to suggest that intelligence is 80% inherited. These claims were widely disputed by many, some saying that it is because of their social standing and opportunities that either race is given. Researchers in the field of behavioral genetics study variation in behavior, as it is affected by genes, which are the units of heredity passed down from parents to offspring. Behavioral genetics has enabled psychology to quantify the relative contribution of nature and nurture with regard to specific psychological traits. One way to do this is to study relatives who share the same genes, nature, but different environment, nurture. Adoption acts as a natural experiment which allows researchers to do this. Empirical studies have consistently shown that adoptive children show greater resemblance to their biological parents rather than their adoptive or environmental parents, as shown by a study done by Plomin and DeFries in 1985 and 1983. Another way of studying heredity is by comparing the behavior of twins, who can either be identical, sharing the same genes, or non-identical, sharing 50% of genes. Like adoption studies, twin studies support the first rule of behavior genetics, that psychological traits are extremely heritable and 50% on average. The Twins in Early Development Study, otherwise known as TEDS, revealed correlations between twins on a range of behavioral traits, such as personality, empathy and hyperactivity, and components of reading such as phonetics,